In this video, we will discuss how to identify streetlights, rental lights, and services, and how this translates into assemblies and construction units in OpenPoint. We created a video just on this topic because it can be confusing. Once you've completed this review, you should have a good understanding of how to identify streetlights, rental lights, and services, and of course, always feel free to contact OpenPoint if you need additional clarification. This video assumes you have a general understanding of assemblies and construction units in OpenPoint. If you don't, please go back and review these topics before continuing. Street lighting is defined as equipment that is used entirely for the illumination of public streets and highways. This includes more than just the fixture itself. It includes poles, wire, conduit, streetlight arms, risers, etc. So if the light that is illuminating an area is not a public street or highway, then it doesn't necessarily fall under the street lighting definition. So below you can see some examples of some various assemblies, the code along with the description directly to the right of it. This gives you an idea of some of the examples as you would see them within OpenPoint. It's important to refer to your utility's tariff on street lighting. Some utilities combine rental lights and street lights into the same category. Before we dive into the details of the first street lighting scenario, I want to take some time to give you an idea of how these various scenarios will be laid out on the screen here. So at the upper right hand corner you'll see a legend that will have the symbol and then the description of what that symbol is. So that's going to refer to the center portion of the screen here that will have a layout of various assets and equipment, and then you can see using these callouts here it'll define some details about what those are. So for example, we have a distribution pole here. It's being called out as having a 35-foot class 4 wood pole material, and then it'll also have an assembly code that represents those. Those assemblies are listed on a previous part of the video where it listed all those out, so you can always refer back to those if you're not sure about what something is. There will also be a key concept in blue that indicates what the key takeaway is for this particular scenario. In the first street lighting scenario, we have a very straightforward streetlight wire fixture pole example. I've already mentioned that we had a pole here, distribution pole, that has our 35-foot class 4 wood pole and assembly, and we also have a wire that is 1/0 triplex, so that's the material for that, and the assembly is a distribution related assembly, the TRIOH1/0. And so with a street light dedicated situation, we have this blue wire and this blue pole representing street light specific assemblies and account numbers. So we've called out the wire in this case here. It is also 1/0 triplex, but because it is dedicated streetlight wire and it's not used for anything else, the assembly is this SLOH1/0T, which indicates that it's for streetlight purposes. Same with this pole here. This is also going to be a dedicated streetlight pole, even though it has the exact same inventory item, this 35-foot class 4 wood pole, that the distribution poles also were using. So you'll see them as exactly the same thing if you were to go out into your system and take a look, but because it's dedicated street light purposes, then it has to have that separate street light assembly. And just to give you some additional information, if you look below here, you'll see that there's actually separate account numbers for each of these. So again, same material here, different assemblies depending on streetlight versus distribution, and then we've got separate account numbers. And so those account numbers are generally defined by regulation, And that's one of the big reasons why you have to differentiate between the different types of assemblies when you're making these decisions out there. And also on this particular pole, there are additional streetlight related assets. So we've got a streetlight arm and also the streetlight fixture itself. Both of those, of course, are streetlight specific. So going back to the key concept of this particular scenario, it's that the pole and wire materials are the same, but the assemblies and account numbers are different depending on the type of service provided. This concept is going to be repeated over and over throughout this training in the various scenarios, so it's really important that you understand this concept before moving forward. In street lighting scenario 2, we are simply extending out scenario 1's example with additional street lighting. As you can see here, we've got additional streetlight wires, poles, fixtures, etc. This is a common situation where you'll see a whole string of street lighting that can go quite a ways in your system. The key concept that as soon as the equipment becomes dedicated to just street lighting, then everything that comes after that is also going to be considered street lighting. In street lighting scenario 3, we're going to mix things up a bit. So in this case, we have the same scenario as last time, only we added a service right off of the pole that has the first street light on it. So you'll see here we've got this purple service wire and then a meter that's coming off of it. And we also have street lighting that from this pole on down is dedicated. So all the dedicated street lighting is all lit up in blue here. So you can see that those are going to get street light assemblies on them across the board. But this pole, it has a street light on it and it has a street light arm on it as well. But because it is serving two purposes, both as street lighting and also as service to a customer, then the pole assembly ends up being a distribution pole and not a service or a streetlight pole. So the key concept is to really make sure you understand if having a streetlight fixture is indicating a dedicated streetlight scenario, in which case everything on the pole will be street lighting, or if it also provides service, or if even if in this case the street light was up here and just the power was continuing to go down the line here, in those cases then it's not dedicated to street lighting, and so then the assembly would become a distribution related assembly. Your utility may use a different term other than rental lighting, such as security lighting, yard lighting, or area lighting. We're going to refer to rental lights and rental lighting for the rest of this video. Rental lighting materials and equipment are often the same as what you're using for street lighting, however the usage is different. If the area being illuminated is not a public road or highway, and the equipment is owned and maintained by the utility, it is generally considered rental lighting. The definition of rental lighting is clarified in a utility's tariff. Some tariffs permit pole, wire, and fixture to be installed, owned, and maintained by the utility, and others permit only the fixture. It's also important to note that rental lighting may not be in your tariff at all, in which case you don't need to separate out rental light and street light assemblies within OpenPoint. Below is a list of assembly codes and associated descriptions for rental light equipment. These will be referred to in the next couple of scenarios that are specific to rental lighting. In rental lighting scenario 1, the area being illuminated by the light fixture is a customer's parking lot, which means that all of the utility-owned assets related to it will be considered rental lighting. The screen here is showing that we have a utility-owned wire with a utility-owned pole all showing up as red. And since this is all dedicated just to the purpose of illuminating this parking lot in this case, then it's all going to be considered to be rental lights. And so just like with the streetlight examples, the material for the wire is 1/0 triplex here, but the assembly is a rental light assembly. Same with the material for the pole. It's the same as the distribution poles, but the assembly is a rental light assembly. And so do note also that we have a arm and a fixture, and because they are also considered to be for rental lighting purposes, they are getting rental lighting assemblies as well. In rental lighting scenario 2, the only difference is the wire and the pole are owned by the customer. We indicated that using assemblies that start with CO for customer owned. You can see that for both the wire and for the pole here. Those will be optional in many cases. It really depends on how your utility wants to track these, so they may not be necessary at all. So please check on that before looking for those assemblies. The street light fixture is going to be considered a rental light because it is used for the illumination of the customer's parking lot, just like in scenario 1. And so we do have the RL fixture assembly listed instead of a street light fixture. Services are defined as overhead and underground conductors leading from a point where the wire leaves the last pole for overhead or the last distribution box or cabinet for underground to the point of connection with the customer's outlet or wiring. Conduit and risers used for underground services are also included. Below is a list of assembly codes and the associated assembly's description. These will be referred to in the forthcoming services scenarios. In services scenario 1, we have a very simple example of an underground service wire and conduit. So in this case, we started off with overhead switching over to an underground situation from this distribution pole through a riser that then goes to an underground wire that connects to this pedestal. And from there, the pedestal has a 1/0 triplex wire going to the meter. So just like in the previous examples where we had 1/0 triplex that was used for multiple purposes, since the portion that's going from the pedestal to the meter is dedicated just to this service, then it's indicated as a service wire, and that's what the SVC URD 1/0T represents here. So just like in our definition, from the point of the last pole, or in this case pedestal, to the customer's wiring or outlet or meter, then that portion only is going to be considered to be the service wire. And this also has conduit, some PVC that is going from the pedestal to the customer as well. So that's also considered to be a services assembly. So note that from the pole on down to the pedestal, that it's still listed as being distribution wire, even though it's the exact same wire that is going to the meter. In services scenario 2, we have a relatively straightforward extension of what we did in services scenario 1. In this case, we have a pedestal that then has multiple segments of wire going to the meter. Each of those segments is considered to be services. The key being that this is the last pedestal or structure that's involved before we get to the wire that feeds directly into the customer. So regardless of the number of segments involved, since there are no other structures in between this pedestal and meter, this all ends up being considered to be services wire and conduit if there's also conduit. In services scenario 3, we have three-phase power coming through overhead distribution lines, going to a pole-mounted overhead transformer and then on to the customer, which in this case is a larger size business. And so this is pretty much the same example as what we had in scenario 1, only the wire sizes are larger and we have a transformer that's involved. Again, since the last structure is this pole with a transformer on it, then anything after that is considered to be service wire. So the key takeaway in this example is that a lot of times when a utility is coming up with their list of assemblies, some of the larger sizes of wire don't have services assemblies associated to them. So if you come upon this situation where you know it's a service that's going to a customer and you have an assembly for it, but it's not a services assembly, then you need to stop there and then create that assembly or let someone know who can create that assembly so that you're not just putting in the distribution assembly in that case. So we see that happening a lot of the times where people will substitute the assembly for something that's not actually services based. And so to try to avoid that situation if at all possible. In services scenario 4, we have a more complex example, but the same rules and patterns apply as what we saw in the previous examples. So in this case, we have a primary metering customer, and we have a utility-owned pole with a meter on it, which comes before a customer-owned transformer. So it's important to note that everything after the meter is owned by the customer. So let's look at how the power is being fed to the customer. So we have overhead three-phase power coming in to this distribution pole here, and it splits off with 4-aught quad three-phase wire going to a utility-owned pole with the customer's meter. So note, we made this purple to indicate that this is the service wire since it's what goes to the meter. So we have our 4-aught quad material defined with the services assembly for 4-aught quad. Note also that we do have a 35-foot wood pole, and that's a normal distribution pole, along with a fuse and arresters, and there could be other items on there as well. Those are all just considered to be distribution items at that point. And so the power then continues on through this customer-owned wire onto a switchgear and a transformer, all of which are also customer-owned. So these may have customer-owned assemblies. Again, those may be optional, so make sure to check with your utility on what you should be tracking for this. But the main concept to understand is that the wire in this case is just the overhead portion that is going to the meter. We have additional wires and equipment that's actually feeding into this large industrial customer, but since that's all customer owned, none of that is considered to be part of the service wire.